I was actually in the process, and I still am in the process of writing a book, and I don't want to disclose the title because the subject will be automatically given away if I disclose the title. The book actually forced me to look at the etymological meaning or significance of the word God. So I literally went through massive dictionaries, old dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary, etymology dictionaries, all sorts of spiritual dictionaries. And it's interesting that, everybody has their own ambiguous, vague definition of God. But when you look at it from a contextual perspective, what the word means, it actually refers to a principle or a being. Some kind of a spirit in entity or a spirit invoked, actually. That's what the word God means, and it makes a lot of sense. Like in the Bible when they said, Moses chose one God for the Hebrew people, which infers, okay, well, if they chose one God, that automatically infers that there's many gods, which is exactly what a lot of this etymological research refers to, is that the God is basically, there are many gods in the universe. We just, as Christians or as Jews or as, Islamic people, they so happen to worship one God. For the Jewish people, it's specifically, the planet Saturn, which they call El. It's basically the wisdom principle, if you will. It's about wisdom, about discipline, about restriction, and that's why they wear the color black. Why they wear the color black is because black from a very spiritual perspective, an esoteric spiritual perspective, it represents age, wisdom, somebody who learns something, and this is why, coincidentally, judges wear black robes, for example. The Christians, they actually venerate the sun, literally the physical sun. They don't know that. They think they worship Jesus Christ, but again, if you do the etymological research behind it, Jesus Christ is really an allegory for the sun. Some people might know that. A lot more people are starting to discover that today, but that is ultimately what the allegory of Christendom refers to, is the worship of the sun. Islam, for example, worships the planet Venus. And that's why they actually wear green, is because green from a spiritual perspective, and this is astrology across the board, across the world. There's no demarcations in terms of cultural differences, which is very unique. So the Islamic nation, they might not know this, but their esoteric aspect of the Islam nation actually worships the planet Venus, which is why they wear green. And this is coincidentally why they're very austere with their women. They venerated the feminine principle, if you will, and that's why their culture is very illustrious with art, humanities. I don't know if you've ever seen Islamic cultures, especially in like Arabia. I mean, it's, decor to the likings, which some, even the best of Leonardo da Vinci doesn't even come comparable to. And that's because they venerated the feminine principle, that is. Just like the Hindu scriptures, a lot of the Eastern Hindu scriptures refer to, they say there's many gods, but one Brahma, meaning that there's one absolute, one inchangeable, immutable something beyond all of it, but there's many gods. So what that means is that the gods are really just principles. They're principal functions in the universe. And that's a hard thing to understand because it's really more of an abstraction than something one can articulate. But it basically means that there are certain virtues in the universe. Some of the virtues are charity. That could be considered a god. Some of the virtues are discipline, austerity, wisdom. That's another principle, which is, again, the El principle or the Hebrew principle, which is why, coincidentally, you see generally that the Jewish culture is very, for the most part, not all, but the Jewish culture is very, they pride themselves in wisdom. And then again, just for a lack of a better term, again, the Islamic culture is very austere in the arts, in beautiful things. Again, if you see their culture, they elaborate in kind of decor, and they venerate their women. Now, a lot of the women in that culture, I know obviously it's a very large overgeneralization, but a lot of the women are now suppressed, which is, it's a byproduct of something much more older, but originally the women were heavily venerated, and that's why they have to wear black, and cloaked up, and you can't see them, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, to answer your question, what the word God means, it's a principle invoked. That's what it means from an etymological perspective, and if you get any good dictionary or reference work, that's what it'll tell you, and what that means, what we talked about, it's essentially a type of energy, a type of force, if you will, a principal force in the universe, of which there are several of them in the universe, and every tradition or culture actually venerates one principle, and there's many other principles. That's why you have pantheism, for example, in the Hindus tradition. You have pantheism where they worship many gods. Well, what that means from a rational perspective or an intellectual perspective for us Westerners is that there's forces that they venerate. Like the force of fire. Now, what that means is that's not necessarily the physical fire like you would have behind me. But what that means is it's like the generative fire of the universe. So you have to think of something much more subtle, something much more psychic than the physical gross fire that you see behind me. It's not like a bonfire, but it's rather the generative force of the universe. That would be one principle. Another principle could be like the water principle. But again, we're not referring to H2O water, but rather the emotional substance of the the emotional substance of the universe, which is equivocal to fire. And then the air principle, which again isn't necessarily referring to the physical air that we're actually breathing, but something like the Akashic records or the ether. And so it's always, it's always not necessarily what you would see with the eyes or feel with the senses, but it's something much more subtle that has its physical counterpart here in the world, but it's that spiritual counterpart that it has that really, all the traditions across the world is what they constitute as God. So, and I tend to agree with them. That theory doesn't contradict with any religion whatsoever. If anything, it actually elaborates on religion. So, I tend to agree with that. There's many gods, but one Brahma, one absolute behind all the forces of the universe. One can say that there's this one immutable absolute, and then the gods really is just various expressions of consciousness. It's certain aspects of consciousness. Again, if we take, and I love referring to the Eastern scriptures, particularly the Upanishads and the Veda of the East, because in my opinion, they elucidate on certain difficult spiritual concepts much more lucidly, much more apparently than the Westerns do. The Western, for some reason, they love to wield everything in allegory, that if you're not initiated, then you don't know what the hell they're talking about, and that applies to the Bible, the Christian Bible as well. But why I like to refer to that is because the consciousness is expressed in many forms. In the Eastern traditions, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for example, it's a very popular Upanishad among some of the Vedic scholars. It refers to basically consciousness can be expressed in a multitude of ways. In the prana, for example, we have many prana, for example. We have actually 5 different aspects of prana, even though the prana is this type of life force that works within you. Then you have the chakras. The standard theology teaches us that we have 7. Some systems say that we have 13. Some say that we have 600 throughout the body. But at any rate, if we take the chakras, for example, then we have 7 of them. We have the earth chakra, the water chakra, the fire chakra, the air chakra, the akashic, and then this is the pineal gland, or the third eye, if people want to call it. Then you have the 8th right above it, which is actually the crown chakra. So each of these energies, they're just consciousness, different types of consciousness, different vibrations of consciousness, if you will. It's really one and the same thing, which when we go back to the absolute, it's the same exact thing. But when it comes a little bit forward, meaning when it starts manifesting into the physical reality that we see here, it starts taking different forms, like the earth, like water, like fire, like air. And then, the etheric realms. And by etheric realms, a lot of people, if they ever speculate, and I always, make this analogy, radio waves. Radio waves doesn't travel in the air, because it can travel to the moon and back. It can travel, like NASA spaceships, for example. And a lot of people don't take that into consideration, because if the radio wave's an electromagnetic frequency, what is it traveling on? Obviously not air. It's traveling on something completely different altogether, because it can go through, hundreds of thousands of miles of void. If, let's say, for example, you got one of these telescopes out in Jupiter, and it's sending signals back here to Earth, like a NASA telescope or one of these, these satellites that are sending images back from Jupiter. Well, what is that electromagnetic frequency or that wave coming into NASA? What is that mediated through? Obviously not air, because air isn't, 500 miles out in outer space. And so really that's kind of a very, an oversimplified example of the Akashic element or the etheric element. So it's something interesting to consider.